has been a large part of my work and still is. Currently focused on a plan of action for people internally displaced by conflict, disasters, and other causes. This is a 3-year multi-stakeholder global plan of action that aims to improve the lives of internally displaced people. And there's 4 priorities in this plan, one of which is the engagement of internally displaced people in processes that affect them, decision making and other. So this is a very relevant topic, not only to this plan of action that was formed to mark the 20th anniversary of the guiding principles on internal displacement, but other work on displacement more broadly. So thank you to the organizers for that. The objectives of this session are twofold. The first is to share experiences and good practices of communities, humanitarian disaster recovery, and actors in socioeconomic recovery and resilience for displaced communities. And the second is to identify key bottlenecks and durable solutions in contexts of disaster preparedness, response, and recovery for displaced persons. By the end of the session, we'd like to have 2 outcomes. The first is a shared understanding of the key issues and impediments to inclusive recovery. And then second is clarity on which joint initiatives and steps can be taken to strengthen the participation of displaced people and the specific vulnerabilities that they may have. So those are the objectives and the outcomes of the session. In terms of the particular format, we'll have a series of presentations. We have 6 panelists, one still on their way to the room, and a very rich and full panel with various country-specific experiences and other global-level lessons learned and expertise. The session panelists will speak for around 8 minutes each, and then we'll follow that with a question and answer discussion period, which will be around 45 minutes. I'll briefly introduce the panelists now, and before each of the presentations give a bit more detail on their background. First, we'll have Professor Walter Kalin, envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. He will be followed by Mr. Anare Lewenikila from the Fiji National Disaster Management Office. After that, we'll have Madame Fatimata Touré, bonjour, the Executive Director of the NGO GREFA in Mali. And depending on travel time, we hope to have Dr. Suprayoga Hadi from Indonesia, the primary planner at the National Development Planning Agency for Special Areas and Disadvantaged Regions. Following that, we'll have Natalia Bal, coordinator for the Joint IDP Profiling Service. And finally, but last but not least, Amanda Entrikin, Director of Global Affairs and Advocacy at Habitat for Humanity International. So thank you to all of the panelists for joining this session. I think it's going to be a really rich set of presentations and discussion. With that, we'll launch into the presentation side of the event, starting with Professor Walter Kalin. In addition to being the envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, he's also Professor Emeritus for International and Swiss Constitutional Law at the University of Bern. And before that, he served as representative of the UN Secretary General on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons, the UN Human Rights Committee and was also Special Rapporteur of the UN Human Rights Commission on the situation on human rights in Iraqi-occupied Kuwait. Other positions included Director of the Swiss Center of Excellence in Human Rights, and before becoming envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, he was former envoy of the chairmanship of the Nansen Initiative on disaster-induced cross-border induced displacement. And of course, former legal advisor to the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement more recently. So thank you very much, Professor Keelan. I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I've been asked to somehow set the scene and provide first an overview on whether or not inclusion of people displaced in the context of disasters, including adverse effects of climate change, should participate, should be consulted, etc. I think if you're looking at international texts, then the situation is very clear. The Sendai framework speaks very clearly about participation, inclusive, accessible, non-discriminatory participation, as it says. That's a very strong but general message. If here take into account that the very large majority of people displaced in the context of disasters are internally displaced persons, then of course the Interagency Standing Committee, that's a UN body, the ISC framework on durable solutions is very important. And it sets out elements of a process that is required to successfully find durable solutions. And that's simply another word for recovery, of course, in the aftermath of a disaster. And it again talks about participation, but as you can see on the slide, there are additional elements that are important. It's not only that you can express yourself, you have to have access to the right stakeholders. And if things are wrong, you need to have access to monitoring mechanisms, whatever they are in the specific situation. And finally, when we're talking about recovery in the form of planned relocation, then the guidance that was developed by UNHCR together with Brookings and Georgetown University again talks very much about the need for participation, for inclusion of all stakeholders, including those who are directly affected. The big question is, what's the reality? These two happy people I met a long time ago in eastern Turkey, and it was recovery not in the aftermath of a disaster, but the aftermath of armed conflict. And they not only looked happy, they were happy, because it was really a very good example of what can be achieved by including IDPs. These people returned to an area that was really destroyed, and they were involved first in already choosing the site where the houses were built. They were included in the planning, so the engineers came up with some ideas, I remember, that were not really culturally sensitive. And they also were involved in building that settlement and also rebuilding their livelihoods. It's a good example. But that's quite rare. Usually it's not about rebuilding lives with all the different aspects. There are also security-related issues, etc. I've seen too many settlements that were just settlements, just housing and not more. And one reason why we then have these kind of projects that are not really helping people to rebuild their lives, in my view, has a lot to do with how we at the international level work, how international organization work. Organizations, agencies have their mandates. And then they go out and ask people to identify whether people have any needs that are covered by the mandate. It's a very siloed approach. And then they need shelter, yes, if you're a shelter building organization. But then you don't look at livelihoods, and vice versa, etc. So probably the way to do it would rather to ask not so much what do you need, but what do you want? Because people know best what they want, and then they can say what they need to achieve what they want, how they see their future. So if we're looking at experiences of what is working, what is not working, and again, this is just an introduction, and we'll hear specific examples from the reality, but this is built on real-life experiences. If you're looking at housing, no, we can start with planning. If you're looking at planning, what certainly does not work are all these top-down projects and programs. What works, for instance, is local participatory planning. A good example from Somalia, where today most people have been displaced in the context of drought. There are, of course, interlinkages with conflict, but it's very much drought in the forefront. UN Habitat IOM have a project called MINIMO, where they bring together at the local level displaced persons, the host communities, local authorities, traditional leaders, put them together for 1-2 weeks to identify their planning priorities. And they come out with a community plan. And then the authorities go out and see with the different actors, the government, the internationals, who could implement what they have decided to be the priorities. That's very much participation. That's very much bottom-up. But even where this is not possible, to have area-based planning rather than planning for specific beneficiaries helps to include all the stakeholders to be more participatory. Housing, of course, you need housing that meets these requirements that I have listed there. And again, my own experience is access to livelihoods is very important. But then very often this is not possible because the land where you can relocate people, it's a bit far away, so they don't have access to livelihoods. Sometimes I really wonder why nobody had ever the idea to simply subsidize for public transportation, to have 3 in the morning a bus that brings the fisher people who are now somewhere inside the country to where their boats are, and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon bring them back when they have sold their fish. No, we are investing into big retraining programs, and sometimes it's as simple as that. And then to have projects where people build their houses themselves, that are being trained on how to rebuild better in terms of better safety. I think that's another approach that helps. And again, there are good examples from several countries where this was done. If we're looking at livelihoods, again, livelihood projects without market analysis, or maybe there is market analysis, but then no access to market. Again, very often it's simply transportation or linking the new economic actors with those who are already there. If this is not working, if this is not done, then it doesn't work. And again, there are here good elements, good practices for livelihood opportunities. You have somewhere people who are in a new location doing farming, planting. Why not link them to a local farmers market? I've seen such examples in Colombia. And again, it's very easy, but then you have to invest. It's not good enough, as many humanitarians do, just to distribute some seeds and tools. You have to invest in the way so that they can produce for the market. And then again, provide for the transportation, etc. So there are lots of things that can be done. Unfortunately, in so many places I've been visiting, it has not been done. And to me, the real cause is that we are working in silos and that we are determining needs from the perspective of our mandates and not really looking comprehensively and holistically at what people need and what they want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kalin. I think that's a good foundation on why participation is important and where we've already seen it work well and the outstanding need to do it better. Next, we have an example from Fiji, from Mr. Anare Lemonikila, the director of Fiji's National Disaster Management Office.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of looking at the topic that we have before us, I've been required to briefly provide some experience on ensuring the inclusion of displaced person in recovery in terms of the Fiji experience. So for Fiji, like in many other countries in the Pacific, displacement has been going on, but we have not placed much emphasis in terms of the work in terms of relation to addressing people in response for displaced persons. But for Fiji, we had a unique situation in tropical cyclone Winston. I think that was a category 5 tropical cyclone, which affected around 540,000 or 62% of our population. So that is where the nexus between displacement and relocation has really come to the forefront, like in many countries in the Pacific. We look at displacement in terms of disaster risk reduction, and we look at relocation in terms of climate change adaptation. So the nexus between DRR and climate change adaptation is now being embedded in a lot of the ways that we do things. That is basically trying to look at addressing people who are being displaced. Because we have internal displacement and also we have relocation. For us, relocation, it takes us 2 to 3 years to relocate a community in the Pacific, because you have to look at our land tenure issues. You have to look at issues that has mentioned earlier in terms of livelihoods, the support that need to be required to put in place. So we look at displacement in terms of looking at our short-term activities in relation to recovery. For us, ensuring inclusion in Fiji, that is already embedded in our national constitution. If you look at our national Bill of Rights, the rights of the child, the rights of women, looking at the rights of education, the right to life. So those are some of the things where we have tried to mold some of our policies in relation to addressing displacement. That is something that we have taken some steps in relation to. And also in terms of looking at our Disaster Management Act and Plan, you might note that if you look at the dates, it's a bit very old, but we are modernizing a lot of this in terms of re-looking at some of our legislation to take into account the new challenges and also the emerging issues that we are facing right now. And also in terms of looking at the protection of displaced people. That is something that government is placing a lot of emphasis and looking at evacuation centers and looking at places where people are being placed. We are placing a lot of emphasis on their security. In terms of displacement persons in the recovery process, a lot of our recovery process in terms of state support have been focused on also looking at displaced persons. We're looking at shelter assistance in terms of the programs that we have put in place for housing. We have tried to prioritize people or the affected population in affected areas in terms of looking at prioritizing those that are displaced, looking at temporary shelters, and also in terms of medium to long-term housing. Looking at welfare, social welfare protection, we have looked at issues like topping up our social protection for 3 months with the assistance of the World Bank. We have looked at a scaling up in terms of looking how best we can assist people with disability and also are being displaced in terms of trying to address some of our social protection programs that we have to allow to support during the recovery process. And also in terms of one of the keys is our superannuation funds drawdown. We allow families of people who are being displaced or affected population, whether they are in the urban area, to draw down on their superannuation fund to assist people or communities in the affected area, especially their families. That's partly basic looking at the traditional coping mechanisms that we have. For displaced person, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of looking at our land tenure system, it is the families that come first. That is the first place they can then be protected in terms of looking at the transition for displaced persons. So basically in terms of looking at ensuring inclusion, that is something that we have been building in our recovery processes, and also in terms of the review of some of our existing legislations and planning. So in terms of looking at the lessons learned on supporting displacement, this is something that is coming clearly, that is on profiling of displaced persons. As I've mentioned, in small countries we have a lot of movement, but we need to profile those that are coming from the worst affected area in terms of the affected population, in terms of the proper identification of people who we can classify as displaced persons. And also in terms of that will help us in terms of continuity of support and engagement. A lot of the government programs, they only go for a duration of early recovery. So we're looking at around a period of 3 to 6 months. But after the 6 months, that is something that we need to look at in terms of the next 12 to 24 months in terms of looking how best we can assist displaced persons. Also to ensure that the programs that we have is better targeted, and also to allow us to monitor progress over time. So in just conclusion, in terms of looking, something that we are working on now is strengthening our national cluster system and our national humanitarian policy. Fiji, after TC Winston, developed a humanitarian policy that is just to improve networking among stakeholders and also to allow us to operate between peace and during times of disaster. A lot of our humanitarian plans or actors, they only activate during times of disaster. We are trying to make them to operate during the full spectrum of both pre and post disaster. That is something that we're looking at in terms of harnessing that particular in terms of looking at profiling of displaced persons. And lastly, is just on building resilience. We have the National Disaster Risk Reduction Policy under the Sendai framework. We also have developed our relocation framework that is to look at all the issues in terms of looking at resilience and how best we can also look at displaced person in our recovery. So basically, in terms of looking at the lessons learned, that is something that we are trying to work on, and also not only cooperate at the national level, but also at the sub-national level, where we are very close to the grassroots population in terms of the work of our humanitarian partners to ensure that we have that element of localization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lemenikila, for the special example from Fiji. Next, the translation is working. Just to confirm that before we move on to the next presentation. Great. Okay, then excellent. We can move on as planned to our next presenter, Madame Fatimata Touré, présidente de l'ONG GREFA à Mali in the Gao region. She's the executive director of this national NGO, which was created 23 years ago to promote the political and economic empowerment of women in northern Mali and contribute to the protection of women's rights. She is also a laureate of the International Women of Courage Award, which is given by the U.S. Department in the presence of U.S. First Lady Michelle Obama. This award honors women around the world who have demonstrated exceptional courage and leadership in the defense of peace, social justice, human rights, gender equality, and the empowerment of women. And she's also expert to the High Representative of the President of the Republic for the Inter-Malian Inclusive Dialogue and has participated in the negotiation process for the Peace and Reconciliation Agreement in Algiers. Madame Fatimata Touré, the floor is yours.
Ok, merci beaucoup Madame de m'avoir accordé la parole et en même temps de me donner le privilège, parce que c'est quand même pour nous un privilège d'être là pour partager l'expérience essentiellement du nord du Mali sur les questions de prise en charge, sinon de renforcement de la résilience des populations déplacées et réfugiées auxquelles nous avons été confrontés pendant près de 50 ans de rébellion au nord du Mali. Oui, mon nom c'est Fatimata Touré. Je viens du nord du Mali et précisément de la région de Gao. Je suis ingénieur agronome de formation, je suis natif de Gao. Et le Mali, c'est essentiellement un pays très enclavé, continental, avec très vaste, perdu quelque part dans le désert, avec une superficie de près de 1 200 000 km². Ces régions du nord, ces 5 régions sur 18. Et ces régions du Nord sont encore beaucoup plus dans le désert. Et c'est des régions qui sont très désertiques, très chaudes, avec un climat très hostile et qui ont vécu depuis 1963 des rébellions successives. Ces régions représentent 75% du territoire malien, avec moins de 10% de la population du Mali, avec une densité de 2 habitants au kilomètre carré. Et cette partie du territoire a été constamment en rébellion pour beaucoup de causes. Les causes sont historiques, les causes sont culturelles, elles sont économiques, elles peuvent être objectives, elles sont internes, elles sont aussi externes. Mais la rébellion de 2012, c'est ça, cette rébellion, le tristement, c'est-à-dire la rébellion qui a été la plus atroce pour le Mali, c'est celle qui s'est soulevée en 2012. Parce que cette rébellion a mis à rude épreuve l'unité nationale du Mali et a aussi provoqué la fuite et le déplacement de milliers et de milliers de nos compatriotes. Et c'est au cours de cette rébellion qu'on a enregistré pour la première fois des enlèvements, des séquestrations, des viols individuels et collectifs, des amputations. Parce que les acteurs qui étaient en face, ils sont divers. Il y avait ce qu'on appelle les indépendantistes, n'est-ce pas, qui voulaient la sécession du Mali. Il y avait aussi ce qu'on appelle les terroristes djihadistes qui voulaient imposer une certaine charia à la population. Donc, c'est la rébellion pour laquelle l'intégrité du Mali a été fortement menacée. Et c'est réellement dans ce cadre que les autorités du Mali ont entrepris des démarches auprès de la communauté internationale pour trouver un cadre idéal de règlement du conflit, de maintien de la paix et de la stabilisation, d'où la nécessité d'avoir une mission de paix comme celle de la MISMA et ensuite de la MINUSMA. Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé pendant cette période? Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé pendant cette période avec les populations déplacées et réfugiées, parce que c'est de ça il s'agit. Effectivement, quand le Mali est rentré en négociation avec ses parties dissidentes, parce que je vous ai dit que les acteurs sont multiples et très divers, avec ces parties dissidentes, avec les parties dissidentes, effectivement, le Mali a réussi à être doté d'un accord pour la paix, qu'on a appelé un accord pour la paix et la réconciliation au Mali, issu du processus d'Argy. Cet accord a été négocié sur 4 grandes composantes. Il y avait une composante qui s'occupait des questions institutionnelles, une composante qui s'occupait des questions de défense et de sécurité, une composante qui s'occupait des questions de développement économique, social et culturel, et une composante qui est la plus importante d'ailleurs, qui s'occupait des questions humanitaires et de réconciliation. Et c'est seulement dans cette composante qu'on parle de la situation des déplacés, en donnant une déclaration creuse, je dirais. Parce que c'est dans cette composante qu'il y a un article qui parle d'accompagner le Mali pour faire venir les réfugiés, les déplacés et contribuer à leur réinsertion. Mais la réalité est le tout autre, parce que nous avons mené des recherches. Et qu'est-ce qui a fait que nous avons été portés, n'est-ce pas, notre visibilité? Sinon, je représente une organisation locale qui a une 20aine d'années d'expérience de travail dans ces régions du Nord. Mais qu'est-ce qui a fait que nous avons été remarqués et que de plus en plus on nous sollicite pour animer de tels panels? C'est que nous avons essentiellement travaillé dans l'occupation. Pendant que l'occupation battait son plein, pendant que les djihadistes amputaient, pendant que les indépendantistes traquaient, enlevaient, séquestraient, on était là. Nous avons mené, avec l'appui de certains partenaires, des recherches. Nous avons mené des recherches pour savoir qui est derrière ces enlèvements, ces séquestrations, ces viols collectifs et individuels, qui est derrière ces amputations, qui est derrière ces séquestrations. Et nous avons aussi cherché à savoir, parce que pendant essentiellement l'occupation, il y a une certaine tranche de la population, ce n'est pas toute la population qui s'est déplacée. Il y a une certaine tranche de la population qui s'est déplacée qu'on appelait la population sédentaire autochtone. Parce que la rébellion est provoquée, la rébellion qu'on a toujours appelée la rébellion arabo-touareg est effectivement provoquée par les Arabes et les Touaregs. Donc les comités arabes et Touaregs sont restés sur place, mais les comités sédentaires autochtones se sont déplacés. Ça, c'est pendant l'occupation. Quand le Mali a repris le centre nord du Mali avec l'appui de la France, les populations arabo-touaregs se sont déplacées et les populations autochtones sont revenues. Et pendant ces déplacements, parce qu'ils se sont déplacés, il y avait des réfugiés, n'est-ce pas? Ces populations, certains sont réfugiés au Niger, d'autres sont réfugiés au Burkina, d'autres sont réfugiés au Mali. Il y a aussi eu assez de déplacements à l'intérieur du Mali. Et les recherches qu'on avait menées pour savoir comment ces populations déplacées vivent, effectivement, contrairement à ce qu'on laisse croire, c'est que dans ces camps de déplacés et de réfugiés, c'est les femmes qui assurent la survie des hommes. C'est aussi les femmes qui assurent la survie des enfants. C'est ces femmes qui mènent des activités génératrices de revenus dans ces camps de réfugiés pour assurer la survie des hommes, pour assurer la survie des enfants et pour aussi assurer la survie de ceux qui sont restés sur place. Oui, c'est pour aussi assurer la survie de ceux qui sont restés sur place. Mais malheureusement, quand il y a eu la négociation, quand il y a eu les accords, la négociation, il n'y a rien dans les accords de paix qui se rapporte à l'accompagnement de la reconstruction de ces populations déplacées et réfugiées. Quand nous les avons rencontrés et qu'on a cherché à savoir, on leur a dit, ça c'est quand le Mali a repris cette partie de son pays, on leur a dit, est-ce que vous savez maintenant que la paix est en train de revenir, vous savez qu'il va y avoir des élections qui vont s'organiser. Vous êtes à l'extérieur du Mali. Il y en a qui sont à l'extérieur du Mali, il y en a qui sont déplacés à l'intérieur du Mali. Vous êtes à l'extérieur du Mali, il va y avoir des élections qui vont aboutir à mettre en place des conseils communaux et des conseils régionaux qui vont gérer le pays pendant que vous êtes à l'extérieur. Ils nous ont posé la question, vous êtes allé signer un accord à Alger. Effectivement, j'ai été partie prendre la négociation. Vous êtes allé signer un accord à Alger. Qu'est-ce que vous avez prévu à ces déplacés réfugiés? Rien. Dans l'accord, rien du tout. On leur a rien prévu en termes de prise en charge ou de représentation dans ces instances de prise de décision. Il y avait aussi ces autorités intérimaires qu'on a mises en place. Et ces autorités intérimaires qui étaient constituées de l'État du Mali, des deux parties dissidentes qu'on appelle la CEMA et la plateforme, rien du tout n'est prévu en termes de place ou de représentativité de ces déplacés et réfugiés au sein de ces autorités intérimaires qui sont chargées d'assurer l'intérim en attendant de trouver des structures légales qui se chargeront du développement local. Ça veut dire quoi? Ça veut dire que quand on se déplace, on perd tous ses droits en termes de participation à la reconstruction. Quand on se réfugie, on perd tous ses droits en termes de participation à la reconstruction. Pendant que là où ils sont, ces réfugiés déplacés sont très actifs. Ils sont très actifs parce que c'est eux qui entretiennent les maris et les enfants au sein des camps de réfugiés déplacés. C'est eux qui entretiennent aussi ceux qui sont restés au village. Et donc, je dirais que c'est réellement une problématique très importante. Et je vais peut-être interpeller la communauté internationale à travers vous pour dire dans les mécanismes de la négociation, il faudrait y penser. Ce n'est réellement pas le cas. Quand on pense à des réfugiés ou des déplacés, oui, nous allons nous y atteler pour les faire revenir, nous allons créer les conditions pour les réinstallations, mais la réalité, elle est réellement, malheureusement, tout autre. Nous avons aussi travaillé à créer la cohabitation, la bonne cohabitation, la cohésion. Parce que généralement, ceux qui partent laissent des traces qui sont difficiles à supporter par ceux qui sont restés. Parce qu'il y a eu des accrochages avant les départs. Donc, il y a eu assez de programmes qui sont financés par certains partenaires pour renforcer ces questions de cohésion, ces questions de vivre en commun entre ceux qui reviennent, parce que ce n'est généralement pas le cas, entre ceux qui reviennent et ceux qui sont restés sur place. Je dirais, je ne vais pas être très longue parce que c'est des histoires très, très passionnantes, n'est-ce pas? À chaque fois qu'on parle, on est passionné. Je dirais tout simplement que c'est quand même des populations, parce que c'est une frange importante de la population qui est restée à la traîne du développement et de la reconstruction. C'est quand même des populations auxquelles il faut penser dans la reconstruction, parce que on a senti quand même des nouvelles discriminations, et même les acteurs au développement n'y pensent pas beaucoup. C'est-à-dire les acteurs au développement, tant qu'ils pensent, chaque fois qu'ils pensent de déplacer des réfugiés, oui, il faut leur donner quelque chose pour s'installer, ils vont continuer à les distribuer des vivres, ils vont continuer à les distribuer des non-vivres, mais on ne regarde jamais les questions qui se rapportent au développement. Parce que s'ils ne sont pas impliqués dans les prises de décision, s'ils ne sont pas partie prenante des actions de développement du local jusqu'au niveau national, ils continuent à être des assistants. Ils continuent à être dans l'assistanat. Et l'assistanat n'est jamais sûr, parce qu'à tout bout de champ, on peut abandonner l'assistanat pour retourner dans les camps de réfugiés déplacés. C'est pour dire qu'il y a réellement des nouvelles formes de discrimination qui sont en train d'être créées. Et je vais peut-être lancer un appel en disant aux partenaires au développement qu'il faut y penser. Il faut réellement y penser. Il faut travailler à ce qu'ils soient partie prenante dans la négociation et que leurs voix soient entendues, leurs actions, leurs préoccupations soient prises en compte dans les accords de paix et de la réconciliation. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, madame, pour les messages très concrets et clairs. Merci beaucoup. Et maintenant, we'll turn to Dr. Suprayoga Hadi, who very efficiently arrived in Geneva this morning, was able to join us direct from the airport. Thank you very much. And we're very happy you're here from Indonesia. Dr. Hadi is a primary planner at the Deputy Minister for Regional Development at the Ministry of National Development Planning in Indonesia. And before that, he had served as Director General of the Development of Special Regions, as well as Director General of Development and Empowerment of Village Communities. He's had various assignments on planning, programming, and monitoring of policies and strategies for the development of disadvantaged regions. And he's recognized globally as a focal person for disaster management policies. Dr. Hadi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadine, and so good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen already. Almost forgot because, I took 21 hours and then just arrived from the airport, and I'm now fasting actually. So it's quite painful actually, but it's okay. For 15 minutes, okay, making a presentation. Okay, thank you, and this is going to be very fortunate for me actually, having this, session actually, sharing about the latest actually, quite a big disaster happening in Indonesia, in Palu, and the liquefaction, effect actually, how the people need to be displaced, how the people need to be moved out from the original location, and because of the what we call the spatial planning is very very strictly applied now, because of the zone of prone disaster prone zone, and which is safer also to the disaster, which is need to be moving people from the original place to the other one. So this is going to be very interesting actually to be discussed and to be shared in. That's why now in Indonesia we would like to add. Previously, if you know about Aceh, back in 2005, we always mentioning about the build back better only. But now we need to add more, term, build back better, safer, and now more inclusive, development. Because we are trying to make sure that all the IDPs, all the victims of the disaster need to be, well involved and well, contributed actually in the process of the recovery. So actually, this is actually the chart that already been updated actually after Aceh and some other big disaster or quite significant disaster in Indonesia, and finally from the last two disasters actually in Palu and previously in Lombok near Bali. Of course, we would like to make sure that from the disaster aftermath, and then trying to have the transition and the early recovery, and then the phase of the rehabilitation, and coming up to the reconstruction and the new relocation. Because we are not only talking now about the 2 R's. It used to be only 2 R's: rehabilitation, reconstruction, and now relocation. Because this is very brand new, activities that need to be open up new settlement, new human settlement, new area of development, new infrastructure, and even new cities. It should be well developed. So we need to move out actually some of the people from the original area to the new area. So that's the way we are trying to see that the rehabilitation and reconstruction of the affected area, as well as the development of the new relocation, which are based on what we call the community-based disaster risk reduction. So at the end of the chart, you can see that's the 3 main agenda that we would like to move thing forward actually. And finally, actually, at the bottom of this chart, you can see which is very important term now, what we call the regional disaster resilience plan. We're not only talking about the rehabilitation and reconstruction action plan, but we need to be sure that the regional disaster resilient plan, because resilient is another job actually. It's not easy task actually. Doing rehabilitation and reconstruction is fine. We've been experiencing a lot of experience from Aceh, maybe a couple of tents actually already been done successfully, but not necessarily it come to the resilience. It is very important, terms that need to be well, approached actually in the new terms. So this is actually what we call the framework itself. So we can have actually at the middle of the chart, emergency relief. We have the early recovery, and then we have the rehabilitation and reconstruction. And rehabilitation and reconstruction can be divided into 2 main aspects. First is what we call the in situ rehabilitation, which is still safe. The area is still safe, and then the area still need to be upgraded or improved, or of course reconstructed and rehabilitated actually. But another one is what we call the ex situ relocation. It is very difficult. Not only moving out the people, but also how to provide land for such a new settlement or new location, which is not such an easy, especially in the big metropolitan city or mega cities. This is very difficult and very expensive actually. But we need to get out from the existing area. So. And then this is actually some example of the what we call how we try to invite the communities as the victims of the IDPs of the disaster to be involved actually in the rehabilitation and reconstruction, what we call the community base. This is actually promoted by the World Bank actually since Aceh. and in Yogyakarta, but it is very, very successfully proven actually in Yogyakarta. You can imagine that in Aceh, which is only maybe about 10 or 20% already been applying this community-based housing reconstruction, but in Yogyakarta, almost 100%. And you can try to compare, in this case actually, 180,000 in Aceh takes for years actually. But in Yogyakarta, 270,000 housing done in 2 years. Because of what? Because of the community base. So this is very, very significant actually contribution of how the community is to be involved in the process of rehabilitation, reconstruction, and recovery. Otherwise, you can rely on the contractors or the developers or the applicators, which takes much more time. And even the effective rate is very low, because some area is not really usable. The people won't be using the housing because it's not their even their type or something like that. Or even the building is okay, but there's no bathroom, no kitchen. But it takes some time because of the developers, sometimes from the NGOs, working on building such housing. But the people won't use it, at all. So just keep them empty. There's a lot of case in the area in Indonesia. So finally, actually, in the case of Palu that I mentioned at the very beginning, this is actually the chart that mentioning about how what we call the spatial plan or the land use planning is very, very important to make sure that the people will be something like placed or settled in a much safer area. Otherwise, they will be still in the disaster prone, like the liquefaction, which is very, very significant, taking lives actually, about more than 2,000 until 10,000 actually, because they are not really very much counted actually, because they are buried under the ground, because it's something like sucked by the by the sand actually, something like the live sand, something like that. So we still uncertain numbers actually, how many people sucked by the liquefaction. So but approximately about 5 to 10,000 actually already been sucked there. So the rest of the lives still need to be moved out. So that's the way we're trying to see that until now actually in Palu there's still the IDPs living in the tents, living in the temporary shelters, but we need to make it faster in moving them out to the safer places. That's why this is the new settlement area that I mentioned previously. And one thing that I need to re-emphasize on this chart is on the bottom there. So involving all parties in the formulation of the contingency plan, especially the community. So the community is a must actually. Need to be involved. Need to be well articulated and well participated actually in formulation of the contingency plan, including the spatial plan, the land use planning, and the settlement plan. So that's actually already been regulated by law. So the people cannot be just ignored or left behind. So it's actually in line with the SDGs principles. So the conclusion here is about actually the community participation is very much improving actually the quality and objective of disaster management. This is very, very true actually. And then the second one, what we call the community-based disaster risk reduction, not only disaster recovery, post-disaster recovery, but disaster risk reduction, because they know where to live safely, rather than the government, because especially what we call the leaders of the community, like the religion leaders, like the ulama or the Islamic clerics, something like that, is very much hurt actually by the people. That's why it's very easy actually to push them through the religious leaders. And then for the community-based post-disaster recovery is still like what we call the community-based for housing reconstruction. And then the fourth one is the role of what we call the village community, because in the very bottom we have the village, like the community level, and the framework for community-based DRR at the village level is very much regulated actually in Indonesia. And then the fifth one is how to prioritize the community capacity building. This is very important because leave no one behind, of course, we agree with that, but it really depends on the capacity of the community. Otherwise, it is just useless. That's why supporting the community-based recovery needs to be rebuild also the capacity building at the community level. And finally, the disaster risk-based spatial and settlement planning to make sure that the people will be safer and much safer and also much inclusive in the future. And finally, what we call the multi-hazard, because we are not only talking about the single hazard, like the one that we have, tsunami, at the same time also earthquake, at the same time also liquefaction. Nobody knows, so everybody needs to be well taught about how they are dealing with the multi-hazard actually in the future. So at the end of the objectives is what we call the community resilience to disaster. It's very important in this message. Okay, thank you, Nadine and gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Hadi, for that coherent presentation despite the obstacles, or I guess the challenges you've had this morning. Thank you. Now that we've had country-specific examples from Fiji, Mali, Indonesia, as well as some other examples mentioned on Turkey, Somalia, Colombia, we'll focus from a more thematic angle. First on profiling from Natalia Ball, that was already mentioned in Fiji's presentation actually. Natalia is from the Joint IDP Profiling Service, and she's worked closely with government humanitarian development counterparts on strengthening the available data and analysis on forced displacement situations. And she has experience from Myanmar, Mali, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, Colombia, Kosovo, and Somalia, and has particularly focused on the collaboration aspect of data collection and analysis, trying to enhance collaboration among local actors, local authorities, national statistical offices, municipalities, civil society, in order to use the data for the protection response. She's also a visiting fellow with the Feinstein International Center. Thank you, Natalia. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadine, and thank you to all the previous speakers with some really interesting presentations, and looking forward to the last one. No pressure to end this panel. Yeah. Yes, as Nadine said, I've been asked to speak a little bit about the role of profiling, or the role of evidence building for the inclusion of displaced persons in recovery and planning processes. And I think I'll try and do that, but I'll also just start with my key message up front, because that's always a nice way to see who's then still listening for the rest. But my key message is really kind of jumping off a number of the specific points mentioned by the other panelists, that really getting things right from the beginning, not the top-down approach, the siloed approach, but the bottom-up participatory strategies and plans. It means having your analysis right in the first place. And that's both a reflection, as you'll hear from some of the examples that I want to share with you today. It's both about the type of data, so what type of data we go out and collect in the first place, what type of questions that we ask, who we ask them to, and how. But it's also about the process through which we enable that analysis and making sure that that's one that prioritizes not only collaboration and local leadership, but also participation of affected communities. So, yeah, now I'm going to explain a little bit those few things, primarily by focusing first on just a definition, because I use the word profiling a lot in my presentation, what I'm talking about, what I mean by profiling. Secondly, why it's important, just elaborating that through a few examples of recent exercises that we've been involved in. But I want to summarize and focus more on some kind of key reflections from those, so some recommendations about what works in terms of building the evidence base for inclusion of displaced persons. So defining profiling, how I use the term, I know it's used in many ways in different languages differently also, but profiling, how I'm going to speak about it, is a collaborative process for data gathering and analysis in displacement situations. It focuses on data that covers a range of topics. It can be very context specific, but broadly speaking, demographics, needs, vulnerabilities, capacities of affected populations, both directly and indirectly affected populations. It uses a mixed methods approach to generating the analysis that it results in, and prioritizes, and this is one important aspect of it, prioritizes the comparison between different population groups. So not only those affected directly by displacement, the IDPs or the refugees, but also those host communities and those indirectly affected in a broader sense. It's useful for informing both operational and strategic decision making, and importantly, as you'll hear from some of the examples, really works best when it's jointly undertaken by key actors involved in the recovery or development planning process, so the government, humanitarian and development actors as the context sees fit, but also importantly the communities to involve, to influence the evidence that comes out of it. A couple of examples. So I think Somalia was mentioned earlier by Professor Walter Kalin, and I wanted to highlight a couple of key reasons why the profiling in particularly the one that happened in Mogadishu helped to include internal displacement in the National Development Plan that was developed thereafter. And I think one of the key, I don't want to dive into each example in too much detail, but one of the key aspects that we've had, both from our own reflection and evaluation of our work, but also what we've heard from partners who are involved, is that the leadership of the federal authorities, as well as the regional administration in the Banadir region, and these two actors working together to not only define, okay, what kind of data do we need to collect and how, but also in its actual implementation, was really critical for the buy-in of the results, and then for making use of that in the work, in this case of the development plan. There was obviously a very strong engagement from a number of humanitarian and development partners, primarily through the protection cluster, which played a very leadership role in the momentum to build around this exercise. But it was really the critical role of the federal and municipal authorities that made the difference. The data itself was also critical, not only the process, because the results demonstrated that what had already the existing data on displacement was very humanitarian in its tone and its results for a number of years. But this was an exercise that enabled us to look at a more balanced way of what are the humanitarian, but also what are the development needs of the displaced community in Mogadishu. A more recent exercise that's actually ongoing at the moment in Al Fasher and Darfur in Sudan, a very different context, a very different focus, also an urban environment. This exercise has been going on last year and earlier in the first few months of this year also. And what was critical here, well, what we hope will be critical here, because it's still an ongoing process given the changes in Sudan at the moment. We're unsure exactly how things will unfold. But the critical role that the World Bank played in bringing momentum to the conversation around displacement in not only in this urban context, but in other places in the country also, was really important to help try and change the dialogue, so change the interest and acceptance from different actors to start asking different types of questions around intentions, around solutions, around what the populations affected by displacement want to do, stay in the urban areas, move, the relocation plans, and the like. So community engagement in some of those questions has really brought about a different type of analysis for this particular context. Its area-based methodology will also prove to be critical as the exercise is also being compared to other similar processes in different parts of the country that have taken a different approach. So the feedback we're receiving at the moment is its area-based structure of the analysis is really making it stand out from some other processes. I've thrown in a refugee example. I know not the main focus of the panel, but one I wanted to share primarily because how participation of communities really changed the entire shape of the analysis. Partners working in Thessaloniki in Greece wanted to look more clearly at a comparative analysis between different population groups, so refugees, asylum seekers, and other spontaneous arrivals or undocumented arrivals in Thessaloniki, so the second city in Greece. But a critical question remained as to how do we measure integration and how do we compare that across these different population groups in different ways, or their different experiences within the city. An integration index was developed with a number of different dimensions, and then we checked in with the communities before collecting the data. Does this make sense? And the answer was basically no. You need to change this. So the whole framework of the analysis was from the start, rather than once the data is collected and it's too late to really change things. From the start was shaped with I think some really important changes in each area of the dimension. So I've put the dimensions there up on the screen to really shape the data collection process as to one that made sense for an integration from communities affected, as well as from the municipal authorities that were in leadership of the process. So a couple of key recommendations that I wanted to pull out. Not all of them will be too much of a surprise from how I've presented the examples here. Are really based on our not only these three examples, but our work over the past 10 years at GIPS, where we work very much to provide support for governments, as Nadine was saying, humanitarian and development actors in displacement contexts. So just to give you a bit of background, because I know not everyone has heard about the service that I'm working for, we're an interagency project that's working with the agencies up there on the screen, primarily focusing in protracted displacement contexts on durable solutions, urban displacement and capacity building, really encouraging stronger and reliable, stronger evidence base with reliable data and sturdy processes around them. Our recommendations particularly, or my recommendations particularly focusing on the question of inclusion for recovery are the following. I think that's six points that I wanted to quickly highlight. One is working with the right partners. Data that comes in from some international consultancy who flies in and flies out when the report is done, it usually just sits on shelves and isn't really integrated into the planning process as much as it really needs to be. So working with the right partners to even shape your evidence base at the beginning is really critical. In an urban context, of course, there will be a key role of municipal authorities. At a national level, there might be, so the right partners change depending on the scope of the exercise, of course, but I think you get my drift. Prioritizing the collaborative process through neutral coordination as much as the quality data, or the quality, validity, relevance of the data as well, is equally important. I've seen many excellent analytical pieces go to waste because there was no clear transparency as to how the methodology was developed and how those key questions were chosen and selected. Linking the analysis with the identified planning process from the start, I think that's also a critical one, and really it's a question of timing. So getting the timing right for your investment in data. If it's not linked at the beginning, and I'm thinking here very kind of basic things in terms of your key pillars of your development plan or the key chapters of a particular recovery framework, to really be able to reflect that in your analytical framework is critical. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to match your findings with the authority to move it then forward, right? Or authority or momentum, and importantly funding to move things forward. Population group comparison is critical. In each of the cases that I've shared with you, and I think in almost every exercise that we've been part of, the differences of experiences between different population groups, for very context-specific reasons often, are one of the most revealing findings. So we don't just take a sort of blanket approach to inclusion of displaced populations, because displaced populations are often not a homogeneous group, right? So there's different groups within that population and associated to it, and it's really important to get that granularity to have an understanding of what inclusion really should mean in practice. Analysis of people and place. Obviously what I've been speaking about here, and I think is a critical message of mine, to really look at the needs of the population, the vulnerabilities of those different population groups, but that needs to be matched to the places in which they're residing, or the places in which they're moving to in the case of relocation, return and other resettlement options. And lastly, I won't dwell on it so much, I think it's been extremely well articulated by the other panelists, but community engagement really increases the validity and usefulness of your results in the first place. I think it's a given from the examples that we've heard about participation within the planning process overall, but I'm speaking here about, even in the data process, so even shaping what kind of questions should we be asking, how should we be approaching this topic, how should we be breaking down our analysis, is something where community engagement itself is often overlooked, far too often overlooked, and can direct our investments much better if we don't do so. And lastly, just to draw attention, and maybe if there are questions about these, I can share more. To mention a couple of global initiatives where we're trying to incorporate some of these lessons into. We also work at GIPS with a range of actors to build global standards to facilitate these type of things, these type of efforts. So through tools and guidance and standards, we're taking part at the moment in an expert group on refugee and IDP statistics, which is prioritizing how to include displaced persons into national statistical systems, which is of course important then for the planning and budgeting decisions that come later. Currently they are not, generally speaking, included in national statistical systems. We've also been working with a range of humanitarian development actors to have a more standard approach or standardized approach to looking at durable solutions. So to looking at durable solutions for displacement, what are the type of questions, what are the type of indicators that need to be captured. And lastly, we are investing and advocating at the global level, but then also practically working within our own tools and field support of how to increase visibility of displaced persons within the SDGs. So looking at data disaggregation opportunities there. Thank you. I'll close with that.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for additional examples of where participation has worked well. We'll move to our last presentation with a focus on housing and shelter. Amandra Entrikin comes from Habitat for Humanity, based in Washington, D.C., where the focus is on creating decent housing for all. She's working to influence the global development priorities of the U.S. government, EU and other regional multilateral organizations, also centered on housing affordability and adequacy. So thank you, Amanda. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks to my fellow panelists. I've been learning a lot and taking lots of notes myself, so more to discuss later. As Nadine mentioned, Habitat for Humanity is an international nonprofit focused on creating a decent place for everyone to call home. We've been around since 1976, founded in the US in rural Georgia, and went global quite quickly to 100 countries. Now we work in 70 countries. And since 1976, we've we've created decent housing for over 13 million people. It's actually a federated model, which is a little different in the NGO world, which basically means that we're 70 local NGOs under a global brand. So really focused on the local needs of vulnerable populations in the places where we work. Programmatically, we don't just do disaster resilience, we focus on all the components of housing. Particularly for displaced populations, we have programs ongoing in Lebanon, Malawi, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, India, where we've focused on disaster resilience and readiness in places like Haiti, the Philippines, Jamaica, and so forth. We also have a global campaign that links the importance of land for housing to disaster resilience. It's called Solid Ground. It's been ongoing for 3 years and it will finish next year. And we have currently 40 countries engaging in advocacy at the local, meaning municipal, state, and regional levels to ensure that land for housing is prioritized. So we try our best to have a holistic approach, Professor Kalin. Holistic and integrated is a pretty big buzzword for us internally currently. But we have some trouble in being action-oriented on being holistic sometimes. In Lebanon, for example, I was just visiting our programs a few months ago where we're addressing the needs in shelter for displaced populations, including Syrians and Palestinians. And although it has a 3-pillar approach focused on improving rental properties, engaging communities, the needs of communities, like infrastructure and micro-infrastructure needs. We also have a livelihood component, but the policy environment in Lebanon is completely restrictive, and we aren't actually able to go forward on the livelihood component, although there is massive need because there's not an enabling environment for that part of our programming. So we do uniquely approach adequacy and affordability in shelter through the many components. Increasing access to basic services, working with communities to address their needs in light of disaster through a participatory approach for safe shelter awareness, working on policies to ensure that families aren't in fear of eviction, specifically working on security of tenure, and working with communities to make sure their homes are ready for whatever relevant shocks they may encounter. So our bias really is that housing is at the center of a resilient recovery after disaster. And we do know that tensions regarding land or land ownership or use really are exacerbated in light of disaster. Conflict can often occur when people have to return. So we've really seen that one of the core impediments to making families resilient, to making sure that their needs are addressed after disaster, lies in their claim to the land on which they live. And a few of my colleagues have addressed the need for security of tenure, which really is making sure that you can call home your home. We've seen that when people fear eviction, they're not going to invest in their homes. They're not going to make their homes disaster ready. They're not going to vacate their homes, actually, when disaster hits, as many of you do see. And this was actually a huge problem that we saw in our response in Puerto Rico. People were not leaving. Families aren't eligible for assistance when they don't have security of tenure. In some of the programs and places where we've worked, a grant from the government may be available for male-headed households. What about female-headed households? What about the individuals that can't actually go to the government offices to get those grants or get that assistance? So we see vulnerable populations being excluded in the recovery process, as we've all kind of mentioned here, and it's based in this lack of ability to have a recognized ownership or occupation of the places where they live. In Jamaica, we've had an exciting program funded by the U.S. government through the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which started as a shelter improvement program working in Portmore in the northern part of the island in low-income communities, where we were looking at micro-infrastructure, we were working on kind of just directly improving housing, working with masons to make sure that they were aware of the most disaster-resilient technologies and methods for improving homes. But we extended the project for another year because we realized that all the work that we were doing was going to come undone because of the lack of secure tenure. So we're working with communities to educate on their rights to the land on which they live, and working with municipal officials to make accessing tenure, whether formal, informal, or wherever on the continuum of land rights they may fall, to have security in what they call home. I have a few more examples, but to respect the time and get some questions in, I will save them for later. But we do have some recommendations on the principles that we want to see in the policies related to security of tenure and land for shelter. So before disaster, obviously inclusion has to be recognized and considered from the outset. Are people's rights to the land on which they live or how they use the land recognized across the continuum of land rights? And not only laws, but financial tools. Are people able to ascertain a loan to improve their home incrementally? If they want to add a bathroom, or if they want to reinforce their foundation, are they able to get a loan that is for that purpose? Laws and regulations sometimes exist, great laws and regulations sometimes exist in places where we work, but they're not implemented at all, and municipalities in some places don't even know that they exist. And even if there is maybe a process for which you can get tenure, get title for your land, the actual documentation doesn't exist, or the process itself is impossible to navigate. After disaster, we think that policies that direct recovery after disaster should obviously reflect a holistic approach regarding land rights and consider each unique context and recognize different forms of tenure, and make sure that community input and community-led mapping specifically is prioritized. When we've integrated communities in the actual surveying of these informal communities or semi-formal communities, land conflicts were identified and addressed in advance of disaster. So I think I'll end it there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I think it also shows how, when we talk about vulnerable populations, one category we shouldn't forget are those with insecure land or housing tenure. Thank you for that. We have 5 minutes left in the session, official timing. If it's okay with the panelists to extend by 5 to 10 minutes more and the interpreter, we can start with a round of questions. I think we'll have time just for one round of questions followed by responses from the panelists. We have a colleague, Barbara, here to help with a microphone for those who would like to ask questions. If you could please introduce yourself before your question, and if we could try to keep it brief in the interest of time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, panel and the audience. My name is Maphaka Dau. I'm the head of disaster management in South Africa. Let me appreciate the very thoughtful inputs that were given by all the speakers. I'm going to ask 2 questions, but the first question is in 3 parts, and I'll indicate which speakers these parts implicate or concern. The question relates to the fact that I want to contextualize it into the South African situation. We're a country that is relatively of moderate to low disaster risk, although we are beginning to see an increase in the severity, frequency, and magnitude of various hazards. And the common ones that we deal with are floods, drought, and fires, both wildland and structural fires. With these hazards, we begin to see levels of displacement of communities, depending on the severity and magnitude, obviously. So the key questions are the politics of displacement and integration. How are the politics of displacement and integration managed in various countries? And do we agree that in every displacement situation, in most of the displacement situation, politics are crucial, especially when you have to make developmental decisions? I was very much interested in the statement by Dr. Hardy in saying that we should also be looking at relocation. But you need to find political support to achieve that, particularly at local government level, especially for us who are based at national level. So that also has to do with Ms. Torres' statement in respect of, the resolution of conflict that results with the signing of agreements that makes the political environment favorable. The second part is the intergovernmental relations arrangement. I was furthermore touched by Dr. Hardy's statement regarding the reconstruction and relocation. How do you make sure that the national statement or commitment finds expression throughout the intergovernmental relations system? Lastly, on the first question is the livelihood consideration, and I think Prof. Kellen touched on that. How do you make sure that you assess the livelihood potential? Obviously, using various sectors that are relevant, agriculture, environmental affairs, and so on and so forth. When you are dealing with integration on a fast-paced mode, our political leaders will say, by next week, we want to see a solution on this. So how do you make sure that you bring everyone on board to address those aspects? The last part, and in the interest of time, is all this important narrative that we are harvesting from the speakers. How do we find this in curriculum, university curriculum, and so on and so forth? Are we having a discourse in terms of which we take this into curriculum? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll just quickly share one experience because I see here a lot of methodology has been discussed, particularly in respect to getting information and making the internally displaced, disaster-induced, internally displaced population. Recently, we have just completed a research that is like we were hearing that how to include the, affected persons. What we did, it's just through giving camera to those who came new to the urban locations, disaster-induced, and they are self-migrants, not relocated because they don't want to be relocated. They don't want to go into resettlement site. They want to go where the growth centers are. In the growth centers, we interviewed the migrant, not interviewed, gave camera to the migrants and also to the city planners, and then asked them, how do you want to develop this particular city, that is Chattogram city, second largest migrant receiving, climate-induced and otherwise, area. And then what the city planners identified are the big infrastructural issues, and what the migrants identified, again based on gender, then ethnicity, then on the basis of their job, everything, like there were diverse kind of opinion. And when we ask both the groups, it's over a 1 year period, both the groups sit together and they have come up with a different kind of planning. And now the city planners are taking this approach, and we are training them to develop Chattogram City new plan, that's upcoming plan, incorporating this model. So I think this is where what we're hearing, how to get these type of inclusion. Thank you.
Could you just introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Tasneem Siddiqui. I'm from Bangladesh. I work on refugee and migration issue.
Thank you very much.
And I teach political science in Dhaka University.
Thank you so much. Just very briefly, my name is Coco Warner. I'm from the UNFCCC, the Climate Secretariat. Thanks to the organizers and the panelists, it was a lot to take in, and very, really interesting and great work that you're doing. I was struck and wonder if one or the other panelist might comment. At some points, it seemed like you were talking about a mix of development, peace-building processes, as well as building resilience and disaster risk management. In the climate world, we're looking to the future and trying to learn what can we do to build resilience. Could you just speak to what we need to learn from you to get the development piece, or prosperity, stability piece bit right as we transition into new climate situations? I hope that makes sense.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ronilda. I'm a director at the Department of Education, or Minister of Education in the Philippines. I guess my question relates to the first question, politics of displacement recovery, but I'd be more specific. How do you reckon in your experiences, the role of national government vis-a-vis local governments? Because especially in decentralized countries where big disasters, when they happen, national government actually really come in for issues of displacement and recovery. But then, local governments assert themselves as having roles. But when you also give the role to local governments, there's politics out there who can receive aid and all that. So how do you reckon in your experience, given that you're actually also making global guidelines and all this? I think there is a need to nuance all this rather than just, big word principles and all that, processes. So I guess your experience might be able to enlighten us on this. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Unai from UNICEF. I would like to understand better, because you were mentioning all the time about participation and bottom-up approach. We really believe it is relevant and strategic, but what about the children and adolescents' participation? It's not because we believe in participation itself, but we really believe that we can make a difference and we take into account the children and adolescents' needs. And I totally agree with the colleague from Habitat for Humanity. It's very beautiful when we design the programs or the approach, bottom-up, community approach, but very difficult to implement because there are many circumstances around our context and our realities that limit our intervention. So what about your experience with children and adolescents?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for all of your presentation. I'm Arvind Kumar. I work in Yemen with UNDP. So especially my question is to Professor Hadi about this special planning. And I'm also a professional on land use planning. So I wanted to understand you that most of the time the politics win, politics and economics win in land use planning. And you talked about the relocation. And we have seen that through relocation, and a lot of exposure has been increased for the people who are really marginalized, who have been evicted and relocated in a reclaimed land or somewhere where the potential of hazards are very high. So how did you deal with that when you talked about the special planning in relocation? Thank you.
Great, thank you. That wraps up the questions for the panelists. Maybe Dr. Hadi, could we start with you, perhaps with the last question and the others that are relevant to your work? Thanks.
Thank you, Nadine, for the first third. Thank you, colleague from South Africa, from Yemen, with the Philippines, maybe Professor from Dhaka, and also UNFCCC. I think talking about the political issue on the location is very clear, and I try to connect with the spatial planning. Spatial plan, urban planning, land use planning is very local. It's never been national or nationwidely, regulated. We have, like in Indonesia, we have the national spatial planning. But talking about the detail resettlement, detail plan, it's supposed to be local plan. So there's nothing to do with the, something like direction or something like that from the central government. Central government is only, preparing what we call the master plan or the blueprint. It's very, very macro. Like the one that I just, very painfully prepared back 15 years ago in Aceh, or just for maybe 9 months ago in Palu. 4 months, we are preparing the spatial, what we call the blueprint for the recovery. 3 months only for the spatial planning. This is very, very crucial. And the regulation will be regulated or enacted by the governor or by the mayor and the head of districts. So the decision is down there, not at the central level. So politically, it's very much locally or decentralized actually at the local level. So the government is just doing some of the direction actually for this is the prone disaster prone still unsafe, and this is safe with the map red zone, orange zone, maybe yellow zone or light yellow. There is no white zone actually there. So means that everybody needs to be very, very careful actually to resettle in that area. And then the second one is really of course the intergovernmental issue is very clear that we are now in a more decentralized actually in doing such a recovery process. Previously, Indonesia is very centralized, and maybe most of the developing countries. But now, after experiencing a lot of experience working on the disaster recovery, finally the local government has to be well prepared and elected. And of course, how to devolve also the authority to deal with such a recovery process now is becoming the local government responsibility actually. It really depends on the massiveness of the disaster. If you are talking about like Aceh with more than 200,000 people and then encompassing different provinces, it will be taken over by the central government. But if it is just only one provincial level or state level with many cities or municipalities there, it's becoming the governor responsibility. And then it's becoming cascading down to the local level actually. And the budget is also needs to be well allocated by the local government level. And the central government is just doing the subsidy actually. Certain subsidy, not all the subsidy coming from the central government. And then finally, actually, along with the land use planning, and I agree with ladies from University of Dhaka. Not all the people needs to be removed or resettled, but there's some consequences by law, because the law for the spatial plan related with the Yemen's question needs to be enacted by the governor, for instance. So the government very responsible in enacting the law for the spatial plan or the land use plan, and then everybody that against the law will be some sanction and some but if there's some negotiation still can be made, if there's still can live in the unsafe area, but the building permit will be very much rigid. You have to be more rely on the construction code, something like that, building permit, building code, which is very expensive and very rigid actually in this case. So it means you can stay there still, but there's some restriction that needs to be followed. Otherwise, you need to move out. So that's some option actually still can be made. But most of the people try to follow actually the resettlement actually in this place. And the last thing that is also very negotiable situation when we have the post eruption in the Merapi mountain, which is very important to be shared. The people need to be moved out from the red zone area because this is very lava, and then also the mountain tip is very dangerous. So the settlement has to be moved out, but the livelihood is still there. So the livestock, the land, like the paddy field, like the maybe some trees, they are still there. So they can be commuting actually from the safer area to the safer livelihood, something like that. So it can be also something like that. So that's the way we are trying. Why it needs to be very localized and decentralized, because the issue is there. So there's nothing to do with the central government to deal with this kind of detailed decision actually in this case.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Sadi. Professor Keelan, can I turn to you?
On the question from South Africa on quick fixes for livelihoods, first I think politicians need to understand there are no quick fixes when it comes to livelihoods. Nevertheless, there are some things that might be possible depending on the circumstances, because they are so diverse. One thing, for instance, is very early on to establish linkages with the local business community, Chamber of Commerce, etc. I remember, for instance, that's in the Philippines, Tacloban, talking to the chairman of the local Chamber of Commerce, saying, there's this relocation site. For our members, it means new business opportunities. But then he had all kinds of administrative obstacles. That's why they didn't move shops there, for instance. But shops there also means some jobs for some people living there, not just for the shop owner. Another possibility that's more in urban areas, that early on one establishes individual portfolios for the people, identifying what kind of assets do you have, what kind of knowledge do you have, what kind of capacities, and then kind of steering them towards possible employers. I remember this was done in Houston after Hurricane Katrina in the US, but it could be done also in other areas. A third possibility more in rural areas, and it's not really being, sometimes it's done informally, but it should be done within frameworks. Rural people arriving in an area where there is land and a certain lack of manpower, where some of the land is not used, to have non-exploitive rental agreements so that these people can work on that land, at least temporarily. As I said, very often it's done in an informal way, but very often then it's very exploitive. So to have non-exploitive arrangements and also provide people with seeds, tools, etc., would be a possibility. And the last point, not everyone who is displaced is necessarily poor. Some of them were business people on their own, had enterprises, etc., were employing people. But now they can't shift their businesses because they can't get loans, because they don't have collaterals, because the collaterals are destroyed. And to have creative solutions there, I think would also something that could help. A second, on the politics of the central and the local governments, a question from our colleague from the Philippines. That's very, very contextual, because first, arrangements on how national and subnational levels relate to each other are so different from one country to another. And then second, how the politics of that are very different from one country to another. You can have countries where they really work well together, and then you have countries where they really fight with each other all the time. But having said that, again, I think there are certain approaches that can be taken. For instance, I think it's very important that the central level kind of establishes the normative and institutional frameworks, but frameworks that leave a lot of room for the local authorities, because circumstances are very different from one place to another. And if you have uniform solutions imposed from the center, then the local level will react, and I think very often for good reasons. Second, you institutionally can kind of bring them together again in terms of working together. For instance, going back to Somalia, what we are just right now exploring is to create district solutions committees, where you not only would have the local authorities and the local communities, the IDPs, the host communities, but also representatives from the line ministries. And if they are really working, and then if you join that to the kind of planning they are doing in the Philippines, then I think you can develop positive relationships. And the third element is one really has to look at the whole issue of what we call fiscal decentralization, the allocation of resources from the center to the local levels. Usually these allocations are made on the basis of the regular population, and displaced people usually are, if they have to move to another place, it's different if they remain within their own municipality, then are not counted as a regular population. And then there are some emergency, disaster emergency funds, but again, it's not the system, because we are talking about long-term developments, long-term processes, and so really looking at how you are doing planning, on how you are doing budget allocations on the basis of the de facto population or the official population. That's very, very important to do it on the basis of de facto population. There are quite a lot of, in that sense, practical things that can be done. But what it shows, and I can't answer your question, Coco, within 1 minute, but it's really about working across silos, the humanitarian development nexus. Who in these situations usually talks about fiscal decentralization? And that's classical development in peace times, in normal times. But if you bring it together, and again, I think the example from Indonesia is really very interesting with these kind of plans in these special situations, because then you can cross these silos and bring all the different aspects together.
Thank you very much. Are there any final messages from the other panelists? Natalia?
Just a short one. I wanted to respond to the comment, I think, from the UNICEF colleague in terms of unimplementable bottom-up approaches or results from a bottom-up, assessment or planning process that just can't work for one reason or another. I just wanted to highlight when I was sharing the examples of that in my presentation, at least. Maybe the message didn't get across so much, but I think it's very much about bringing them together, and how we changed in the example of Greece, and this can be replicated elsewhere, was actually bringing an integration index and therefore kind of priorities that made sense for the municipality and for the different population groups. So not everything, they wanted to be in there got in there in the end. It's obviously, you need the mixture of the feasibility, practicality, and also the aspirational aspect of those. And lastly, I just wanted to jump in on the kind of innovative methods, if you like. I didn't really get into the discussion on methods, and that's a whole different conversation. But I think it's also really important to highlight that we should be open-minded and embrace different ways of understanding community interests and different contextually relevant ways of doing that. But I would also highlight that it's important to make sure that kind of qualitative, deeper analysis is also combined with some kind of hard figures for planning and for budgeting and everything that you need to take then on afterwards. So yeah. Indeed. Yeah, that's all I wanted to add. Thanks.
Thank you. Amanda?
Yes, just so briefly, I wouldn't be doing my programmatic colleagues justice without just throwing in that from an NGO perspective, we do have concerns with focusing on relocation, and rehabilitation on site should be prioritized. In some of the places where we've worked, and thinking in one African country in particular, relocation is taking place along ethnic lines, which obviously has its issues. So just to throw that out there, to be the devil's advocate, I guess, or the NGO's advocate, same thing. But also to respond to the UNICEF colleague, in ensuring the voice of children is represented. We try our best as outsiders often to, in the communities where we're working, to work in coalition. So working with women's groups, working with children's rights groups. In most cases, they're the most tied into their communities. In most cases, they're the ones that have access to the people. When I was in the Palestinian refugee camp in Beirut, there was no way I would have been able to walk around without the women's group leading us. And they had helped identify the vulnerable families that we were helping upgrade their rental properties. Very specifically, there were children with very specific health needs. There were disabled families. There were female-headed households. So although I think the ideal would be to sit down and speak with children directly, often they have advocates that we try to work with effectively in all the places where we work. So.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. And then finally, Madame Tour and Mr. Lunikina, are there any final messages from your side?
From my side, finally, now, what has been taught, we are talking about political will. I think everything comes down to political will. Government is there to create the enabling environment. If there is no enabling environment, the donors, humanitarian, cannot act in this space. So I think political will is very important if government has the will to look at a lot of these issues, especially in relation to displacement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll have to finish there, but I think we've had a lot of good examples come forward that could be collected, both from the conflict context, but also disaster displacement context. There could be learning across those different contexts, but there's still a long way to go. We also heard and really ensuring the meaningful participation of displaced people. For those of you that would like to further discuss or learn about the issue, there are two more events happening this week. One on Wednesday, another side event on disaster displacement at 1 p.m. in room 14. And on Thursday, May the 16th at 4:30 p.m. It's a working session on disaster displacement in room 4. So there's still time and space to discuss. We hope you'll join those events. Thank you to all the panelists for your very rich presentations and discussion, and to all of you for coming and for being flexible with the timing. We appreciate it, and thanks also to the interpreters and the organizers of the event. Thank you. Good afternoon.